Mother of the Wolves by Daniela Parker. Read by Angela Bond, Emily Kocianski, Kennard Baker, and Charles Flum. The Rose Garden. We were on the road for hours. Every so often the driver, a burly man in a navy blue shirt and jeans, stopped briefly for a snack and to use the restroom while he charged up the van. Then we continued on. I didn't bother asking where we were going. I knew somehow we would be safe. And each time the van stopped, I'd grow fearful the government might find me, so I refused to get out, not even to use the restroom. I just hid in the back of the cold van. The highway became wooded and bent around thick mountains. We must have been somewhere in Massachusetts. The van spiraled down a small road deep in the forest and dead-ended at an estate enclosed by brick walls thickly overgrown with ivy. The driver pressed a few buttons on the intercom.
Yes?
"We have a 2871, he said. The steel gate slowly rolled open, and we drove onto the large grounds. The driveway forked into a roundabout. There stood a tall statue of a woman whose hair was tied in a loose bun, and whose delicate hand held a rose as she gazed pensively out at the rose bushes surrounding her stone body. Behind her lay a grand mansion. 2 great oak doors with windows decorated in black iron were centered at the entrance. The building itself was a massive brick structure standing 4 stories high. The windows were framed in white wood, and 3 triangular white peaks lined the roof. The middle section of the house held a beautiful white balcony at the very highest point, and on each wing were smaller balconies and windows that framed the center in perfect symmetry. The van pulled to a stop in front of the entrance, and the driver hopped out and slid open the side door. "Come on," he said sternly. We walked up to the door, and the man who had rescued me struck the door knocker hard 3 times. Then suddenly, the heavy right side of the double doors swung open, revealing a thin, elderly man in a white hospital coat. "Welcome," he said. "We are going to help you. Come in. Please don't be alarmed." I stood in awe at the entrance. The mansion was really a hospital with patients bustling about. Some had shaven heads and some walked with oxygen tanks or were being wheeled by nurses. There were people playing ping pong in a room that would have been a den to the right, and nurses dressed in light blue and white old-fashioned style aprons and nurse caps walking gingerly through the foyer. "My name is Dr. Levine." The man shook my hand. "When one escapes, we try to be ready." He jerked his head backwards and laughed with his mouth opened wide. "Come in," he said again, ushering me into the den. He sat me on a crimson leather sofa facing a lit fireplace, then stoked the fire a bit so it crackled and the orange flames swelled up. "I thought this would be more comfortable." "I'm sorry, but may I use the restroom?" I asked. "Of course." He pointed to a small room with a dry chuckle. "Right there, take your time." The bathroom had twin marble sinks and towels trimmed in silk with an embroidered rose sewn into each of them at the center. I was spotting again. I wiped myself off and flushed the toilet, and then washed my hands in the marble basin. There was a bouquet of flowers between both the sinks, with paper towels sitting in a basket and soap and lotion bottles decorated with brass rose vines sitting next to the towels. When I returned to the fire, Dr. Levine was sitting cross-legged on the sofa, with his left arm hung over the back, looking at me. His white hair was just long enough to start to poke straight up. He had a strong chin and a long defined nose, and his eyes had huge bags under them, not from lack of sleep, but from years of age. His cheeks had fallen several centimeters below where they would have been in youth, and sunk deep into his bones, giving his entire face a certain iciness of character as he sat waiting for me expressionlessly and half lit by the firelight. "Did you know?" he asked. "I knew something was wrong," I replied. "But nowadays, you don't go to the doctor." "I'm sorry." He lowered his head. "Come, sit down." He patted the seat next to him, smiling as I sat beside him. "You may have figured out by now we are a hospital that helps treat patients with cancer. You will have state-of-the-art care here. No one knows about this place. It's my home. It was my parents' and their parents' home. We are generations of doctors, surgeons, and so on. When things happened as they did, I converted this home into an underground hospital. We wait for people like you and try to catch them before the dogs get them. Are you going to test me now? He surveyed me up and down quietly, one eye lifted higher than the other in a scholarly manner. Then his face softened into another smile and crow's feet appeared at the corners of each eye. We are going to feed you now and put you to bed, he chuckled. You've had a long day, and tomorrow will be longer. Miss Bethany? A plump woman came quickly to his side. Take Miss Elliot to the cafeteria and then show her to her quarters, please. Yes, Dr. Levine. I haven't been hungry lately, I interjected. They never are, he smiled. A sudden pain radiated in my head just above my eyes. I squinted, shielding my headache from the brightness of early morning. The long window in my room had filled with sunlight, and the beams were dancing on the white sheets of my bed, causing such a brilliance of light that I was roused from sleep. I saw a small French dresser sitting across from me, a huge bed frame with 4 wooden pegs at each corner towering high above me. There was a nightstand to my right, with a blue Tiffany lamp sitting on it that matched the blue and white decor, and to the left, an upholstered chair with perfectly folded women's clothing set on top. I moaned and sat up, grasping at my forehead in agony. The pain was getting worse by the minute, and sitting up made my head feel like a bowl of water slushing pain around in a whirl. I urgently needed some CP. Reaching into my pants pocket, I pulled out a small black cardboard box. Empty. Panic suddenly overwhelmed me. It had been 12 hours at least, and I would go into shock. I grabbed at my head and curled into a fetal position, throwing the covers over myself. Someone came in, but I didn't look up to see who it was. We don't use CP here, ma'am. Let me give you something to help. But before I could tell what she administered, before I could even look up at her face, I went into a convulsion and blacked out. I felt like my brain was imploding and the crushing pressure gave way to brilliant light. Help me! I screamed, grabbing at my head in horror. My stomach was nauseated and my hands were clammy and trembling. I blacked out again and a series of horrible fever dreams ensued. And in them, men were surrounding me, laughing. Help me! I found myself lost in a labyrinth of mingling consciousnesses, stumbling from memory to memory like cobblestones, caught in a morbid dream with the very real pain of my throbbing migraine gripping my soul and twisting and wrenching at every moment. Each time I gained consciousness, I swore I'd never take caffeine powder again. And when the dreams overtook me, I was drowned by an ocean of monsters, deriding me as they stretched my body over a vast expanse of sea. I struggled to yell, but the words didn't come out of my mouth, and so I dove deeper into the abyss of this dream and lingered there, floating in its deepest waters. The darkness was thick and peaceful and encompassed me like a warm embryonic fluid, my hair soft and light fanning out like wispy peacock feathers. I stayed there for a moment, hovering in absolute isolation, then was awakened, and the still water slushed around me, tiny air bubbles escaping from my mouth, dream cycling again. When I awoke, the same light was penetrating through the window and shining down on my bedspread, but my headache had subsided, and now the peaceful song of a single bird was singing a celestial melody. It must have been the following day. I sat up, remembering the clothes sitting on my bedside, and checked the size of the shoes sitting next to it on the floor. They were my size, and for a moment I felt uneasy with the fact that they had clothing waiting for me that was exactly my fit, but those feelings quickly subsided as the desire to put on something fresh and clean took hold. I tried on the black skirt and the blue blouse given to me and slipped on the new shoes. On the dresser was a beautiful mirror and a comb on a silver plate. I examined myself a bit and fixed my hair into a messy ponytail, then ventured out of my room. There was a long hallway with doors on either side. People were walking down the hall, so I figured if I followed them, I'd find breakfast somewhere along the way. We came to a huge dining room with a long table that must have seated about 20 people in very fine oak seats. A woman looked up at me from her chair and smiled gently. "A new one!" she exclaimed. She was a bit thin, had very short blonde hair, and wore a yellow sundress that brought out her pretty blue eyes. I hadn't brushed my teeth, so I smiled, but kept my lips shut as much as possible to hide my morning breath. "Hi," I said, sitting next to her. "Did you come in last night?" "A few nights ago," I said, nervously picking up a fork and playing with it in my hand. "That CP will kill you," she laughed. "But what can you do working all the time?" "Are there many runners?" "Not that many," she replied, "but we get a few here and there." She rested her hand on my shoulder. She was in her mid-30s, but time had only increased her beauty. "Don't worry," she said. "Dr. Levine is a kind man and will take care of you." She studied me with an amicable smile, then added softly, "I have breast cancer." I looked down at the plate and dropped my fork, which clanked on the porcelain. "I don't know what I have." "They'll find out," she said, resting her hand lovingly on my shoulder. A man rolled a cart with large white bowls of food into the room. "That smells delicious." I hadn't smelled those scents since I was a child when my grandparents brought home bacon for a special surprise one Christmas. Once global warming started affecting the planet, we were only rationed a certain amount of meat per month. When the sea level finally rose 1 full meter, there were a lot of things people had to deal without. The ocean had become acidic, causing fishing to become almost obsolete, and drinking water had become scarce as rivers and lakes began drying up due to the higher temperatures. You could expect to pay about $6 for an 18-ounce bottle of water and forget drinking out of the tap because they didn't purify tap water anymore. It was just too costly. We all learned in biology about the food chain. Historically, no one ever thought those lessons mattered much. But then the coral reefs started dying away, and many fish became extinct. The animals that regularly fished began dying off as well, but some of the larger birds and mammals flourished as they preyed on the weaker, hungrier animals. Thousands of varieties of animals vanished when they couldn't adapt fast enough to the changing environment. But after years, the food chain rebalanced itself, for better and for worse. With meat being so scarce, farming became more of a highly sought-out job that provided resources for the elite rather than a blue-collar job that provided a basic commodity for everyone. The farming market went up in value, and poor farmers became rich overnight, if they knew enough science to keep their crops growing. "Eggs and bacon," the lady said. "It's my favorite, too." She put her fork down to shake my hand. "By the way, I'm Alice." "I'm Stephanie." "Would you like eggs and bacon, ma'am?" the server asked. "Yes, please." Just then, Edward entered the room. He was clean-shaven now and casually dressed. He noticed me as soon as he came through the doors and then found a seat at the very end of the table across from us. "Does he have cancer?" I asked in a lowered tone, so he couldn't hear. "Oh, him?" replied Alice. "No, that's Dr. Levine's son." Suddenly, a young woman entered the room and began speaking with him. It seemed important because he got up without eating and walked off. After breakfast, Alice helped me find Dr. Levine's office. Alice and I had become friends from that first day. We didn't even want to part ways from my appointment, but the doctor insisted I be alone, and so we waved goodbye and she closed the door, leaving me standing alone in the cold doctor's office with Dr. Levine. "Please sit down," he said, motioning to the bed in the center of the room. I tossed off my shoes and jumped up onto the white hospital bed, letting my bare feet dangle back and forth in the uneasy silence. Dr. Levine turned to the counter and sanitized his hands. The smell of the hand sanitizer filled the room with a strong lemony scent. "How was your breakfast?" he asked, twisting and rubbing his long fingers together. "Very good, thank you." He turned to me and sat down in the chair next to the bed, placing his clean hands on his gray pant legs. "Today is all about finding out what cancer you have. Then we will discuss your care plan." His face sunk back into that melancholy look that was almost disheartening, but his eyes carried the liveliness of a small boy as they searched my face for answers. I worried he might find some secret inside my heart, so I turned away from him and looked submissively down at my dirty toes. "I'm ready," I said. This had been an amazing miracle for me, a second chance at life. It was as if the mansion was some wonderful dream come true, as if maybe I really had been dragged down the hall, and this was a sort of life after death. Dr. Levine got up and started towards the side door, then turned back to me and added, "Don't be alarmed, but we will be using a dog. His name is Dr. Marlowe. He is the quickest way we have to tell where to start looking. Is it okay with you if I bring him in?" He must have known from experience I'd have some PTSD associated with dogs. I really didn't want to see a dog, but I sighed and told him it was okay. Dr. Levine opened the door facing an adjacent room and disappeared for a minute. I could hear him unlocking a kennel and the dog scurrying out. Then he returned holding a black leather leash with Dr. Marlowe trailing behind him. Dr. Marlowe was an old German shepherd. I could tell by the touch of white on his snout and paws. He sat beside Dr. Levine, panting. "Okay, Dr. Marlowe," he commanded. "Dig for cancer." He let loose the dog, and Dr. Marlowe sauntered up to me while I jumped down from the bed and stood before him so he could smell me better. The dog sniffed around my body and then stood right in front of me, burying his nose into my bladder. Then he put his paw on my lower stomach and barked. That could be a few things. Have you had any other symptoms?" "My periods aren't regular. I spot a lot." "Then it is most likely some sort of gynecological cancer." He walked over to the phone and dialed. "Miss Bethany, we need an ultrasound." Then he turned to me casually and said, "Strip off your clothing and put this on opening up in the back. Take off everything, even your underwear and bra. We'll conduct a pap smear and an ultrasound. I'll leave you for a few minutes." I put on the gown, and a few minutes later he entered with Miss Bethany, who was wheeling in a huge ultrasound device. I laid myself back on the bed. Then he put my feet in the stirrups and spread apart my knees. Dr. Levine put on his rubber gloves and felt around for my cervix with his cold fingers. I shifted uncomfortably, taking in a deep breath through my nose as I concentrated on the ceiling. He took out a long metal tool and began pushing it up into my vagina. "This will pinch just a bit. Sorry," he said, digging deeply. I tried not to pay attention to the procedure, tried not to notice him at all. "Does this hurt?" he asked. I looked back at him. It seemed that where a wrinkle disappeared, one would appear in another spot. His lips pursed together as he felt around the inside of me with the cold metal tool. Then it clicked, scooping up a sample, which he set aside on the counter. At once he turned with his gloved hands to my abdominal area, pressing firmly on my right and left side with his other finger still stationed internally. "Yes," I replied uneasily. Miss Bethany turned on the ultrasound machine. "Now for the fun part," he said, grabbing something that looked like a microphone. "This is a transducer probe." He squirted some gel on my bare stomach and pressed the probe firmly on my skin. Miss Bethany pushed some buttons on the machine, and a 3D hologram appeared above me. "This is your uterus." He glided the probe to my right, and a fallopian tube appeared with an ovary. It looked exactly like it was really standing in front of us, a grotesque white veiny thing that looked to me like an alien rather than an organ. "Here is your right ovary. As you can see, there are 2 cysts growing on this one. And now let's check the left." Another image of my left ovary appeared. "This looks like the cancer, but we will biopsy all of the cysts. Do you see this cyst?" He pointed with his other hand to the hologram, showing me a huge cyst that was grown into my ovary. "We may have to remove this left ovary. Bethany, 2 endometrial cysts on the right ovary and a pathological cyst on the left. Please conduct general blood tests and a CA-125. We will schedule surgery as soon as possible." "Yes, Dr. Levine," Bethany said as she methodically began getting the needles ready for my blood work. "Have lunch and dinner and enjoy. Tomorrow you will not eat all day as we have to prep your bowels for the surgery. We will do the surgery Thursday morning. Don't worry. This is pretty standard. I'll see you soon." Dr. Levine left and Miss Bethany sat me up for my blood work. She took a few vials of blood. She was an inherently quiet woman. I tried to start some light conversation with her. It must be wonderful working in a place like this. She looked up at me but did not smile or say anything in response, then went back to the vials, writing on little white stickers she placed on each one. Her dyed dark brown hair was swept up in a bun, and during the morning her hairpins had loosened, causing the bangs to fall a little more loosely around her face. She was a plump woman. Her breasts were large masses that sat on a round stomach. She was a woman with some heftiness in the arm as well. She looked like she could have played sports as a young girl, but the muscle had turned into fat over the years, making her arms look like two strong branches growing out of an apple. Miss Bethany was a woman not to be messed with. Her years had given her such maturity and discipline that her presence in the room carried the weightiness of a barge. Somewhere inside her there must have been a tale of suffering and perhaps passion which ended tragically, and that is why I guess she did not speak a word to me. Over the years, her lack of laughter had caused her skin to dry and crack around the mouth. Her lips had tightened and shriveled and her cheeks lost their rosy hue. I felt for her, for all flowers blossom too soon and wilt too fast, and the prettiest ones are plucked and always die the fastest. "You are free to roam the premises. Lunch is served at 12:30, she said dispassionately. "Oh, okay," I said as she stood up with the vials and began rolling the huge cart back out of the room. Once I put my clothes back on, I searched everywhere for Alice, but couldn't find her anywhere. Soon I found myself outside on the patio, where to my amazement lay before me a huge garden of roses of every different variety. The first of the roses was a bush of beautiful purple blossoms. I stopped to smell them as the sun lit up its large petals and buried my nose into one of the roses, taking in its soft fragrance with my entire being. Then I started walking through the garden, down paths that turned and winded around until I was lost in a sea of colors. The mansion was far off, but could still be seen in the distance, and there were some trees scattered here and there with stone benches set under the shade of their majestic limbs. I sped up my pace, looking left and right. The walkway split like a maze, and I forgot how to get back. I tried to peer over the large bushes, but they were too tall. So I walked a little more until I came to a ring of trees at the very center of the maze. There was a beautiful fountain, and red rose bushes were climbing up its pedestal and enveloping the shallow bowl filled with koi. Edward was sitting on one of the benches reading a book on his e-reader, with one shoe crossed over the other knee. He looked peaceful enough, and I didn't know if I should disturb him, but thought the greater social mistake would be to not say anything about my presence. "Hello," I said, waving my hand up in the air.
"Oh, good afternoon,"
he said, putting aside his e-reader. "Sorry," I began walking towards him. "I found this garden and got lost." He laughed and his smile stretched from cheek to cheek and dimples appeared.
"Yeah, it's okay. Have a seat, please."
I sat awkwardly beside him. He turned towards me just enough so we wouldn't be uncomfortable as we spoke together in such close proximity.
"Do you have family at home?"
he asked. "My mother passed away when I was a child, and my father disappeared 10 years ago."
"Anyone else? Children? Husband?"
"No," I said, nudging my body a little bit further from him. "You?"
"No, only my father. Dr. Levine is my dad."
"You must feel very lucky. He does a lot for people."
"Yes, a lot."
He seemed disturbed by the conversation about his father, so I changed the subject. "What are you reading?"
"It's a novel about an alien world, a science fiction."
"Oh." Then he changed the subject.
"You like roses?"
"Yes," I smiled. "I love these. My favorites are the purple. They smell so good." We laughed.
"I like the ones with the peach and white on them,"
he said.
"There are a lot of varieties."
He stood up excitedly.
"This one here is a miniature rose. We planted it here so you can see the fountain easily."
He turned towards the wall of bushes behind us, surrounding the ring of trees.
"These are climbing roses. Beautiful, aren't they?"
"Yes," I replied, giggling at him. I leaned back and my long hair flowed down to the bench.
Anyway,
He stood up tall, placing both hands on his hips, doing some sort of masculine strut.
most people think of roses like your standard hybrid tea, the ones you get in a bouquet or something.
You really know your flowers, I giggled. He looked at me for a moment, then caught himself from staring too long and hard and faced down towards his e-reader on the bench.
I can take you back if you want.
He took my hands as I stood up, and suddenly we were facing each other awkwardly. I looked down, embarrassed. There was a spark between us, but I didn't intend to fall in love. I didn't look back into his eyes, but started walking away from him towards the fountain, skimming my hand across the surface of the cool fountain water, coy scurrying away. He folded up his e-reader and inserted it into his pants pocket. When I faced him again, his face had hardened. He started walking back through the garden as if I wasn't there. I followed behind him uncomfortably, wondering if I had offended him. When we reached the lawn, he gave me a nod and left.